July 11th, 1944. A hedgerow field south of Carentan, Normandy. A German machine gunner lay behind his MG-42, fingers resting on the trigger, watching a column of American infantrymen move across the far side of a pasture 400 yards out. They were crossing in the open. He had a clear field of fire. The belt was loaded. His assistant gunner had a second belt ready. The Americans had not seen him. He did not fire. His Feldwebel, crouched 3 feet to his left, did not order him to fire. Neither man moved. Neither man breathed loudly. They watched the Americans cross the field, disappear behind a hedgerow on the far side, and continue south. And then they exhaled. This is a story about a weapon so terrifying that the United States Army made a training film just to convince its own soldiers not to panic at the sound of it. The MG-42 fired 20 rounds per second. American soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. Its sound was not a series of individual shots. It was a single, continuous rip, like someone tearing a bedsheet in half. In the first weeks after D-Day, entire platoons froze in place the moment they heard it. Men pressed their faces into Norman mud and refused to move. Company commanders reported soldiers who could not be persuaded to advance across an open field if an MG-42 was somewhere on the other side of it. And yet, by July of 1944, 6 weeks into the campaign, something had changed. German machine gun crews along the Normandy front were reporting a problem their training had never prepared them for. The problem was not a shortage of ammunition. It was not mechanical failure. It was not a lack of good positions. The problem was that firing the weapon had become more dangerous for the crew than not firing it. The most lethal infantry weapon of the Second World War was being neutralized, not by a better weapon, not by a secret technology, not by air support, but by the way American infantrymen fought when they heard it. If this story helps you see the Second World War differently, a like and a subscription help it reach the people who care about this history most. To understand what happened in that hedgerow field, why a trained machine gunner with a perfect shot chose silence over fire, you have to understand two armies that looked at the same battlefield and saw completely different wars. Every army builds its smallest unit around a philosophy. The philosophy answers one question: where does the killing power of a squad come from? The German answer, refined across 2 world wars, was the machine gun. The MG-34, and later the MG-42, was not a support weapon attached to the squad. It was the squad. Everything else, the riflemen with their bolt-action Kar 98K rifles, the ammunition carriers, the assistant gunner, existed to keep the machine gun firing. German riflemen were not expected to generate decisive firepower on their own. They were there to protect the gun, to feed the gun, to move the gun. A German squad without its MG was a body without a spine. The American answer was different, and the difference was not obvious to anyone until people started dying. The United States Army built its squad around the individual rifleman. Every man in a 12-man rifle squad carried an M1 Garand, the only standard-issue semi-automatic rifle of any major army in the war. A soldier with a Kar 98 had to work a bolt between every shot, pulling his cheek off the stock, breaking his sight picture, cycling the action, reacquiring the target. A soldier with an M1 Garand pulled the trigger, and the rifle loaded itself. He pulled the trigger again, and again. 8 aimed rounds in the time it took the German across from him to fire 3. This meant something that no training manual on either side fully grasped until Normandy made it obvious. It meant that when a German machine gun opened fire on an American squad, the response was not 4 or 5 bolt-action rifles shooting back at intervals. The response was 12 semi-automatic rifles and a Browning automatic rifle, all firing at the muzzle flash, all at the same time, within seconds. But that was only the first layer of a problem the German machine gunner did not yet know he had. Because behind those 13 weapons was something else, something no muzzle flash could reveal. something the gunner would not see coming until it was already falling on his position from above. And to understand that, we need to go back to a morning 7 months earlier, on a hillside in Italy, where a German MG crew did exactly what they were trained to do, and learned, in 90 seconds, that the rules of their war had changed. December 15th, 1943. A ridge above the village of San Pietro Infine, Italy. A machine gun crew from the German 29th Panzer Grenadier Division had been dug into a stone terrace on the south slope of Monte Sammucro for 11 days. Their MG-42 covered a narrow draw, the only approach the Americans could use to reach the village below. The position was textbook, camouflaged with local stone, interlocking fire with a second MG-42 80 yards to the left, pre-registered mortar coordinates behind them. They had stopped 2 American attacks already. Both times, the pattern was the same. The Americans came up the draw, the MG opened fire, the Americans hit the ground, and after 20 minutes of trading shots, they pulled back, carrying their wounded. On the morning of December 15th, the third attack came. This time, the Americans were from the 143rd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division. Texans, most of them, some barely 20 years old, and most of whom had never been in combat before the Italian campaign began 10 weeks earlier. What happened next took 93 seconds. The MG-42 opened fire at 300 yards. 7 Americans dropped flat behind a low terrace wall. The assistant gunner fed the belt. Tracers stitched across the draw exactly as the crew intended. And then everything the German gunner understood about infantry combat broke apart. Instead of staying down, instead of pressing into the earth the way soldiers on the Eastern Front always did when an MG opened on them, the Americans returned fire. Not 1 or 2 rifles, all of them. Every weapon in that squad fired at the muzzle flash simultaneously. The gunner heard something he had never heard from enemy riflemen before. A continuous, rolling crack of semi-automatic fire, not the spaced single shots of bolt-action rifles, but a sound that blurred together like a slower, deeper version of his own weapon. Dust kicked off the stones around his position. Chips of rock stung his face. He could not raise his head to re-aim. Hold that detail. He could not raise his head. A man behind the fastest-firing infantry weapon in the world, a weapon that put out 20 rounds per second, could not lift his eyes above the parapet because 7 riflemen with semi-automatic weapons had put so many rounds onto his position in the first 4 seconds that looking up meant dying. The assistant gunner tried to shift the belt. A round struck the tripod. Another cracked past his ear. He pressed himself flat. And then the mortars came. Somewhere behind the American squad, a 60mm mortar team had watched the MG's muzzle flash and begun dropping rounds within 15 seconds. The first bomb landed 20 yards right. The second landed 8 yards behind. The third landed on the terrace itself. Stone and dust erupted into the air. The MG went silent. 93 seconds. From the first German burst to the last American mortar round, a weapon system that had dominated infantry combat for 4 years, silenced in less time than it takes to boil water. Now here's the part worth understanding, because it explains why this was not luck. What happened on that hillside was not heroism, and it was not improvisation. It was a system so deeply built into American infantry doctrine that the men executing it did not have to think about it. The riflemen did not decide to fire at the muzzle flash. They had been trained at Fort Benning and at a dozen camps across the United States to do one thing the instant they took fire: shoot back, immediately, at the source. Not wait for an order, not wait for the squad leader to identify the target, not wait for the BAR man to set up. Find the flash, aim at it, pull the trigger. Every man, right now. This was not how other armies fought. The British trained their riflemen to take cover first, assess second, and fire when ordered. Soviet infantry was taught to advance in mass, absorbing casualties until the machine gun ran dry or was flanked. German riflemen were trained to stay low while the MG did the killing. The American rifleman was trained to answer fire with fire, personally, instantly, and with aimed shots. And the M1 Garand made that training lethal in a way no bolt-action rifle could match. But remember, the rifles were only the first 93 seconds. What followed was the part that German machine gun crews had no doctrine to survive. Because behind every American rifle squad was a chain of firepower so fast and so coordinated that it turned a single muzzle flash into a death sentence, not just for the crew, but for every position within 200 yards of it. That chain started with a man most people have never heard of, working in a cinder block building at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1941. And what he built there would eventually kill more German soldiers than any weapon the United States ever pointed at the Western Front. The man at Fort Sill was named Orlando Ward, and what he built was not a weapon. It was a method, a way to turn a single radio call from one man lying in the dirt into a coordinated strike from every artillery tube within range. But the method only mattered because of the man at the other end of the radio. The man nobody talks about when they talk about American firepower, and the man German machine gunners had the most reason to fear. He was called a forward observer, and he was lying in the mud right next to the infantry. This is the detail that changed everything, and it is worth understanding precisely. In most armies in 1944, artillery operated on a request system. An infantry officer identified a target, sent a request up the chain, and waited. A staff officer at battalion or regiment decided whether the target was worth the shells. If approved, the fire mission was relayed to a battery. The battery computed the data. The guns fired. The process could take 10 minutes, sometimes 20. Sometimes the request was denied because the shells were allocated elsewhere. The American system was different in a way that looked small on paper and was catastrophic on the battlefield. Every American infantry company had a forward observer, a trained artillery officer who walked with the riflemen, carried a radio on his back, and had a direct line to the fire direction center. He did not request permission. He called the target, read the coordinates, and the FDC computed firing data for every available battery in seconds. Not one battery, every battery within range. The FDC could take a 6-digit grid reference from a lieutenant lying behind a hedgerow, and within 3 minutes put the concentrated fire of an entire artillery battalion, 18 guns, onto a single point. And here is the number that mattered to a German machine gunner. Remember it, because it will come back. 3 minutes. From the moment a forward observer saw a muzzle flash to the moment 18 high-explosive shells landed on that position. 3 minutes. January 24th, 1944. The slopes above the Rapido River, Italy. A German MG crew from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division opened fire on a patrol from the American 36th Infantry Division, attempting to scout crossing points. The crew was experienced. They had fought in Sicily, and before that, North Africa. They knew to fire a short burst, 2 seconds, 40 rounds, then displace laterally to a prepared alternate position before counterfire arrived. On the Eastern Front, this technique had kept machine gunners alive for years. Soviet mortars were slow. Soviet artillery was powerful but blunt. It saturated whole grid squares, not individual positions. The crew fired their burst and began to move. They did not make it to the alternate position. The forward observer attached to the American patrol had been watching the far bank through binoculars. The instant the MG fired, he marked the muzzle flash against a reference point, the corner of a stone wall, and read the coordinates off his map. He spoke 6 words into his radio. At the Fire Direction Center, 2 miles behind the river, a sergeant plotted the coordinates on a firing chart, computed elevation and deflection for 3 batteries, and transmitted the data to the guns. 107 seconds after the machine gun fired its first burst, 54 rounds of 105mm high explosive hit the hillside in a pattern 60 yards wide. The MG position, the alternate position, and the connecting trench between them disappeared under a curtain of dirt, steel, and stone. The crew that had survived 2 campaigns across 2 continents died because they had been trained for a war where artillery was slow. The war they were now fighting was not slow. Think about what this meant for the next German machine gun crew down the line. They heard the MG-42 open fire to their left. They counted the seconds, waiting for the mortar response they expected. Instead, less than 2 minutes later, they heard the freight train sound of massed artillery. Not mortars, not a single gun, but a full battalion concentration, landing on their neighbor's position. And they understood something their training had never covered. The first burst from their MG-42 would not just attract rifle fire. It would not just attract mortars. It would bring the full weight of American divisional artillery onto their heads within the time it took to smoke half a cigarette. The weapon they had been told was the backbone of German infantry defense had become a beacon, a signal that told the Americans exactly where to drop a curtain of steel. And this was still only the second layer of the problem, because the Americans were about to add a third, and this one would come not from behind the infantry, not from the sky, but from inside the hedgerow itself, driven by a man the German machine gunner could hear but could not see, grinding forward through the earth at 4 miles an hour. June 13th, 1944. A dirt lane south of Caumont-le-Venté, Normandy. Sergeant Robert Groover of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, was lying on his stomach in a sunken road, listening to a sound he had learned to hate in the 7 days since Omaha Beach. Somewhere ahead, behind a wall of earth and tangled brush taller than a house, an MG-42 was firing in short bursts. He could hear it clearly. He could not see it. He could not see anything except the hedgerow directly in front of him, a bank of compacted soil 3 to 4 feet thick at the base, topped with trees and vines so dense that light barely came through. The entire Normandy countryside was built from these walls, fields the size of a tennis court, each one enclosed on all 4 sides by living fortifications that had been growing since before Napoleon. And inside each field, somewhere in the green darkness at the base of the far hedgerow, a German machine gun crew waited with a sight line that covered every inch of open ground. Everything the Americans had learned in Italy stopped working here. The M1 Garand advantage, every man firing at the muzzle flash, depended on seeing the flash. In the bocage, the MG-42 fired through a gap cut at the base of the hedgerow, a slot barely a foot wide, screened by brush. The muzzle flash was invisible from more than 50 yards. American riflemen fired into the hedgerow, and the hedgerow ate the bullets. Rounds buried themselves in 4 feet of packed earth. The machine gunner kept firing. The artillery advantage, 3 minutes to a battalion concentration, depended on precision. In the bocage, the forward observer could not pinpoint the MG's position because he could not see past the next hedgerow. And even when coordinates were accurate, the high-explosive shells that had shattered open positions in Italy detonated against the tops of the hedgerows, showering dirt and branches, but leaving the crew dug in at the base untouched. The earthen walls that had penned Norman cattle for centuries were absorbing American artillery the way sandbags absorb rain. And the tanks could not help. A Sherman, attempting to cross a hedgerow, had to climb the embankment, which tilted its belly skyward, exposing the thinnest armor on the vehicle to any German soldier with a Panzerfaust. Tanks that tried it were destroyed in seconds. Tanks that stayed on the roads were channeled into kill zones, where a single anti-tank gun could block an entire column. Within the first week of hedgerow fighting, American tank commanders refused to advance without infantry clearing the hedgerows first, and the infantry could not clear the hedgerows without tanks. The system was paralyzed. German machine gunners, who had been afraid to fire first in the open terrain of Italy, suddenly had something they had not had since the Eastern Front: positions that could not be seen, could not be shelled effectively, and could not be flanked by armor. The bocage gave the MG-42 its invisibility back. And the Germans knew it. Interrogation reports from prisoners captured in the third week of June reveal a confidence that had been absent since North Africa. German company commanders described the hedgerows as ideal for economy of force. A single machine gun crew, properly dug in, could hold a field for hours against a full platoon. They rotated crews through positions the way a factory rotates shifts. One German officer told his interrogators that in the bocage, the Americans could bring all the artillery they wanted. It would not matter, because the guns could not see what they were shooting at. He was right. For 3 weeks, he was right. But he made the same mistake that every army fighting the Americans eventually made. He assumed the problem would stay static. He assumed that the army struggling in front of him in June would be the same army in front of him in July. It was not. Because while German machine gunners were settling into their hedgerow positions and congratulating themselves on finding terrain that neutralized American firepower, something was happening behind the American lines that no German intelligence report detected. It was happening in open fields requisitioned from French farmers, in makeshift workshops assembled from salvage, in conversations between sergeants and tank crews who had never spoken to each other before the bocage forced them together. American infantry officers were teaching tank crews how to read a hedgerow. Tank crews were teaching infantry officers where a Sherman's gun could aim and where it could not. Artillery forward observers were learning to crawl to within 100 yards of German positions to call in fire with precision the batteries could not achieve from the rear. And in the yard of a farmhouse near Colombière, a 29-year-old cavalry sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey, was staring at a pile of German beach obstacles, the steel crosses the Wehrmacht had planted on the Normandy sand to rip open landing craft, and seeing something no one else had seen yet. His name was Curtis Cullen, and what he built in that farmyard over the next 48 hours would break the bocage open like a door. Cullen did not explain the idea. He built it. He took a cutting torch to 2 of the steel hedgehog obstacles, the X-shaped beams the Germans had welded together and buried in the sand at Omaha to gut landing craft, and cut 4 prongs from the scrap. Each prong was roughly 3 feet long. He welded them to a crossbar, and welded the crossbar to the front hull of a Sherman tank. The whole device weighed about 100 pounds. It looked like the jaw of something prehistoric. Then he told the driver to aim at a hedgerow and hit it at 10 miles an hour. The prongs bit into the embankment, pinned the tank's nose down so the belly never lifted, and the Sherman pushed straight through the wall of earth and vegetation like a man walking through a curtain. Dirt sprayed in both directions. Roots snapped. The tank emerged on the far side with its gun level, its armor facing forward, and its crew already scanning for targets. General Omar Bradley saw the demonstration and said 5 words that every tank crew in First Army would hear within a week. He ordered every available Sherman to be fitted immediately. Ordnance crews worked around the clock, cutting up German beach obstacles. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25th, 3 out of every 5 tanks in First Army had tusks welded to their hulls. The soldiers called them rhinos. But the rhino was not the weapon. The rhino was the key that unlocked the weapon. The weapon was the system that came through the hedge behind it. Here is what that system looked like when it worked, and here is why it terrified German machine gunners more than any single piece of equipment the Americans had ever brought to Normandy. July 26, 1944. A field east of Marigny during the second day of Operation Cobra. A German MG-42 crew from the 353rd Infantry Division was dug into the base of a hedgerow on the southern edge of a rectangular field, roughly 150 yards long. They had a clear field of fire across the grass. A second MG position covered the eastern hedge. Mortar coordinates were pre-registered on the center of the field. It was the same setup that had held Americans to 300 yards a day for 5 weeks. At 0740, the crew heard a sound they recognized, the low grinding of a Sherman engine somewhere behind the northern hedgerow. But the sound did not stop at the road. It did not turn. It kept coming. Then the hedgerow shook, dirt erupted outward, and 33 tons of steel broke through the embankment into the field, with its 75mm gun already traversing south. The machine gunner had a choice that was no longer a choice. If he opened fire on the infantry following the tank, he would reveal his position to the Sherman, which would put a high-explosive round into his hedgerow within 5 seconds. If he fired on the tank, his 7.92mm rounds would bounce off the hull like gravel. If he stayed silent, the infantry would sweep the hedgerow line with grenades and BARs within 2 minutes. He fired. Training overcame logic. He aimed at the infantry emerging through the gap in the northern hedge and pressed the trigger. The Sherman's gunner saw the muzzle flash at the base of the southern hedgerow. He had been watching for exactly that. The turret traversed 11 degrees left, the gunner's foot hit the trigger, and a 75mm high-explosive shell hit the embankment 3 feet above the MG position. Earth and timber blew inward. The concussion alone would have killed the crew if the shrapnel had not. The second MG on the eastern hedge held fire. The crew had watched what happened to the first gun. They lay flat, pressed into the earth, and did not touch the trigger. This was the moment. Not a date on a calendar, not a line in an after-action report, but this specific tactical reality repeated across 100 Norman fields in the last week of July, when German machine gunners stopped being the hunters and became the hunted. The system that killed them was not complex. It was 3 elements arriving together: a tank to break the wall and draw the fire, infantry to flank and clear, a forward observer walking with the riflemen, ready to call in battalion artillery on any position the tank and infantry could not reach. Each element depended on the others. A tank without infantry was blind to Panzerfausts. Infantry without the tank was pinned by the MG. Both without the forward observer were vulnerable to German mortars. Together, they were a machine that consumed hedgerow fields at a rate the German defenders could not match. And the rate was accelerating. Because the Americans were doing something with this system that no German commander expected, and no German doctrine had an answer for. They were not just using it, they were teaching it, spreading it laterally through the army, faster than the Germans could build new defensive lines. And the method they used to spread it is a story almost no one tells, even though it may be the single most important reason the United States won the ground war in Western Europe. Here is a fact that sounds impossible until you understand the system behind it. On July 14th, a rifle company from the 29th Infantry Division developed a specific method for assaulting a hedgerow defended by a machine gun. The method involved a Rhino tank breaking through at one corner of the field, while a 60mm mortar team dropped smoke on the MG position, and a squad worked around the opposite corner under cover of BAR fire. It worked. The company took the field in 9 minutes and lost 1 man wounded. On July 19th, 5 days later, the same method was being used by a company in the 4th Infantry Division, 12 miles to the east. The company commander had never met anyone from the 29th. He had received a 1-page mimeographed sheet prepared by 1st Army Headquarters, describing the tactic in plain language with a hand-drawn diagram. The sheet had been distributed to every rifle company in the Corps within 48 hours of the original after-action report. 5 days, from invention to Army-wide adoption, in the middle of a war. This is the layer of American combat power that no one puts in a museum, and no documentary spends time on, because it has no sound, no muzzle flash, no explosion. But it is the layer that broke the German army in France, and it is the reason that German machine gunners did not face one clever squad. They faced an entire army that learned like a single organism. The Americans called it the lessons learned system. In practice, it worked like this. Every infantry division had a team of officers whose sole job was to collect after-action reports from company and battalion commanders within hours of an engagement. Not days, hours. A lieutenant from the 30th Division who figured out that placing his BAR team on the same side as the tank, not the opposite side, the same side, so the MG crew could not split their attention, would write that observation in a report before he slept that night. By morning, the report was at regiment. By the following evening, an extract was at 1st Army headquarters. By the end of the week, a mimeographed bulletin carrying that observation and a dozen others like it was in the hands of every rifle platoon leader in Normandy. The bulletins were not theory. They were not doctrine written by staff officers in London. They were the voices of sergeants and lieutenants who had just done the thing they were describing, who were writing in the dirt-plain English of men who needed other men to understand quickly or die. One bulletin from the 2nd Armored Division described the correct distance between a Rhino tank and following infantry in a single sentence. Close enough that the Germans could not get a Panzerfaust between them, far enough that one mortar round could not kill both. Now think about what this meant from the German side of the hedgerow. A machine gun crew that survived an engagement in the 2nd week of July had learned, through blood, what the Americans would do. The direction of the tank, the timing of the smoke, the angle of the flanking squad. They adjusted. They shifted the MG to cover the corner where the tank would come through. They dug a second position to cover the smoke line. They were veterans, and they were good. And then, in the 4th week of July, a completely different American division attacked their sector using a variation of the tactic. The tank through the center of the hedge instead of the corner, smoke on both flanks instead of one, and a second squad looping behind through a drainage ditch that the first version of the tactic had not used. The German adjustment was wrong. The position was overrun in 6 minutes. This was not coincidence. This was a system that harvested innovation from every engagement and distributed it faster than the defenders could adapt. Every German solution was already obsolete by the time it was implemented, because the American tactic it was designed to counter had already evolved into the next version. The German army had no equivalent. German tactical skill at the squad level was extraordinary, arguably the best in the world. Individual German NCOs improvised brilliantly. But those improvisations stayed local. A technique that worked for a Feldwebel near Saint-Lô did not reach a Feldwebel near Caen, because the communication infrastructure between units was shattered by Allied air power. Because the rigid hierarchy of German command did not encourage lateral sharing the way the American system did. And because Germany was losing its experienced NCOs faster than it could replace them. Every lesson died with the man who learned it. By the end of July 1944, the gap between the two armies was no longer about weapons. The M1 Garand still fired the same 8 rounds per clip. The MG42 still fired 20 rounds per second. The artillery had not changed caliber. But the American army was learning as a whole, and the German army was forgetting, one dead sergeant at a time. And that is when the question from the title of this story stops being a question and starts being a verdict. Because what happened next? In the first days of August, when American armor broke free from the bocage and poured into open country, turned a tactical problem for German machine gunners into an existential one. August 7th, 1944. A crossroads 2 miles east of Mortain, France. The German attack came at midnight. 4 panzer divisions, ordered personally by Hitler, drove west toward Avranches to cut off Patton's breakout and seal the bocage shut again. It was the largest German counteroffensive since Normandy began. The lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division pushed through the American 30th Infantry Division's forward positions in darkness, overrunning outposts, scattering headquarters companies, and reaching the edge of Mortain by dawn. On a rocky hilltop south of town, Hill 317, 700 men from the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, found themselves surrounded. German armor and infantry controlled every road below them. They had no tanks, they had no resupply. They had one thing. They had forward observers with working radios. What happened over the next 5 days on Hill 317 is the answer to the question this story has been building toward, stripped to its purest form. German machine gun crews set up positions around the base of the hill to prevent breakout. They had excellent fields of fire. Open slopes, scattered rock, thin brush. Any American who moved on the hillside was visible. The MG teams had ammunition. They had infantry support. They had armor behind them. They did not fire. Not because they had not been ordered to. Not because they lacked targets. But because every crew on that perimeter had learned, through 6 weeks of hedgerow fighting, through watching position after position get obliterated, through carrying the pieces of men who had pressed the trigger 1 second too early, that the moment they fired, the hilltop would answer. And the hilltop did answer. Every time a German unit moved within range, the forward observers on Hill 317 called coordinates into their radios, and the response came from miles away. 12.5 artillery battalions, concentrated by the fire direction centers into a wall of high explosive that turned the fields around Mortain into a landscape no living thing could cross in daylight. Think about that number. 12.5 battalions. That is approximately 225 guns, controlled by a handful of lieutenants lying on a hilltop with maps and radios, placing fire on any target they could see with the precision of a man pointing his finger. German MG crews that opened fire were silenced within minutes. Crews that repositioned were tracked by the observers and hit again. Crews that held fire and waited for darkness found that American infantry on the hill used the quiet hours to adjust mortar positions and pre-register new coordinates. There was no window. There was no moment when firing the weapon was safe. A captured NCO from the 2nd Panzer Division told his interrogators that his machine gun crew had spent an entire day in position without firing a single round. They had targets, they had ammunition, they had orders to suppress the hilltop, but the gunner refused, and the NCO, a veteran of the Eastern Front, did not overrule him. Because both men had watched a crew 40 meters to their right open fire that morning and cease to exist 90 seconds later. The weapon that had been the backbone of German infantry for 25 years was sitting in the grass, loaded, aimed, with Americans in the open at 300 yards. And the men behind it would not touch the trigger. This is the full answer to the question. Not a single invention, not a single battle, not a single weapon. A system, built in layers, each one reinforcing the others, each one making the German gunner's choice more impossible. Layer 1, the M1 Garand. Every American rifleman fires back instantly. The MG crew is suppressed within seconds of opening fire. Layer 2, the 60mm mortar. Dropping rounds on the muzzle flash within 30 seconds. The crew cannot stay in position. Layer 3, the forward observer and the fire direction center. Battalion artillery on the position within 3 minutes. The crew and its alternates are destroyed simultaneously. Layer 4, the Rhino tank. Breaking through the terrain that once protected the position. The crew has nowhere to hide. Layer 5, the lessons learned system. Every American unit adapts in days. The German countermeasure is obsolete before it is tested. Each layer alone was survivable. Together, they were not. Together, they transformed the MG42 from the most feared infantry weapon on the battlefield into a device that killed its own crew faster than it killed the enemy. And the men who understood this best, the ones who felt it in their hands every time they gripped the trigger, were the men who had to decide, in 100 fields across France in the summer of 1944, whether to do the job they had been trained for or to stay alive. Most of them, by August, chose silence. And that silence is where this story ends, and where one man's story begins its final chapter. July 11th, 1944. The hedgerow field south of Carentan. The German machine gunner who did not fire that morning was 23 years old. He had been in Normandy since May, transferred west from a garrison posting in Denmark, where he had spent 2 years guarding a coastline no one attacked. His name does not appear in any after-action report. He did not receive a decoration for his restraint, and he did not write a memoir. What is known about him comes from a single entry in the war diary of the American 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, which passed through that sector on the afternoon of July 11th, and noted that a German MG position had been found abandoned in a hedgerow on their left flank. The weapon was still loaded. The ammunition box was full. Beside it, in the dirt, the crew had left 2 canteens, a mess kit, and a letter that was never translated and never filed. They had simply left. Walked away from a loaded machine gun with Americans in the open in front of them, because they had decided that the weapon they carried was more dangerous to them than to the men it was pointed at. The MG42 remained in German service for the rest of the war. It was never replaced. It was never redesigned. On paper, it was the same weapon in April of 1945 that it had been in November of 1942. 20 rounds per second, 1,200 rounds per minute, the fastest-firing infantry machine gun any army had ever fielded. But by the autumn of 1944, captured German soldiers were telling their interrogators something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. They were saying that the MG was a curse, that being assigned to a machine gun crew was a death sentence, that experienced soldiers volunteered for anything, mortar crews, supply columns, even pioneer units that cleared minefields, rather than sit behind the weapon that every American rifle, mortar, tank, and artillery battery on the front was trained to find and destroy. The weapon had not changed. The war around it had. Curtis Cullen, the sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey, who built the Rhino device from German beach scrap, never saw the breakout his invention made possible. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his work, but by the time the award was processed, he was no longer in France. In November of 1944, in the Hurtgen Forest, the bloodiest stretch of woodland the American Army fought through in the entire war, Cullen stepped on a German mine and lost his right leg below the knee. He was evacuated to England, then home. He returned to New Jersey, took a job as a salesman, and lived quietly on a residential street in Cranford until he died in 1963 at the age of 48. There is a plaque on a boulder outside the Cranford Municipal Building. Most people who walk past it do not know what it commemorates. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, the 700 who held Hill 317 at Mortain for 5 days, were relieved on August 12th when the German counterattack collapsed. They had called in over 18,000 rounds of artillery during the siege. Their forward observers had directed fire so precise that German armor burned within 200 yards of their foxholes. Of the 700 men on the hill, 357 were killed or wounded. The battalion received a Presidential Unit citation. The forward observers received nothing beyond their regular pay. The German officer who told his interrogators in June that American artillery did not matter in the bocage was captured near Falaise in August. His division had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. He did not repeat his earlier assessment. Here is the answer to the question in the title of this video. And it can be said simply now because you have walked the full distance to reach it. American troops made German machine gunners afraid to fire first by building a system in which every trigger pull was a death sentence. Not through one weapon, one tactic, or one act of bravery, but through a machine of interlocking layers that punished the machine gun for doing the only thing it was designed to do. The M1 Garand answered in seconds. The mortars answered in half a minute. The artillery answered in 3 minutes. The tanks came through the walls. And the lessons traveled faster than the enemy could adapt. It was not genius. It was not luck. It was the grinding, relentless, institutional will of an army that refused to accept a problem it could not solve. The MG-42 never stopped being deadly. But by the summer of 1944, the deadliest thing about it was pulling the trigger. Thank you for staying with this story for nearly an hour. If it showed you something about this war you had not seen before, a like is the single best way to help it reach the next person who cares about this history. And there are more of us than the algorithm thinks. Subscribe if you have not, and turn on the bell so the next one finds you. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and whether anyone in your family served in the Second World War. My grandfather's generation did not talk about what they did. Maybe yours did. Tell me in the comments. Those stories deserve to be heard.